Well, first off, I want to take a moment and thank Bill Simons and Cassidy Lent and the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum for giving me this opportunity to deliver this presentation titled Gil Hodges, Jim Pegram, and Me, a Baseball Autoethnography. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be able to put this piece of research together and present it at the Cooperstown Symposium. Now, since this is a piece of personal research, it's probably important for me to kind of talk a little bit about myself and my background. I grew up in a baseball crazy family and played Little League Baseball through about the age of 12 or 13. But it was at that point where I was really starting to have trouble seeing the ball and particularly picking up curveballs. Now, anybody who knows me also knows that I started wearing glasses around the age of 15 or 16. My eyesight was probably failing me by the time I was 13, and I just didn't realize it. Now, maybe that's just an excuse, and I'm going to run with it. But in recent years, having become the co-chair of the Nine Spring Training Conference and now picking up a co-editorship with the Nine Journal on Baseball History and Culture, I have really been blessed in meeting and being around a number of former players and executives. As you can see here, this picture of me with Rod Carew at Anaheim Stadium back in 2019. So baseball is very much a part of my past and my present and my future. Now, what is autoethnography? It's essentially the study of personal culture. And so when we get into looking at elements of culture, we know that there are, the culture is made up of various symbols and rituals and language and values and various norms. And we also know that baseball, therefore, has a culture. We know that it has symbols. We know that it has its own common language. We know that it has its own rituals and routines, right? From taking me out to the ball game to the standard food that we might eat. We know the expressions of Mendoza line and paint the black. We know the various, symbols and logos within the sport as well. George Melch, who is both a noted baseball writer, but then is also an anthropologist, said this, that the sports that we play and how we play them also tell us who we are as a people. And that sort of sentiment was echoed years earlier by researchers who, in looking at baseball and culture, said, because the world of baseball is the world of the United States, a microcosm is neither all good nor all bad, but an amalgam of our better and worse selves. The game calls us to community, promotes a democracy based on merit, fosters closeness with our parents and our children, and preaches a vibrant patriotism. We know that there is something particularly special about sports culture and, therefore, baseball culture. Now, with an autoethnography, what you're really attempting to do is answer a so what question. We can tell our stories, we can look at our own research, but ultimately we want to be able to connect that to bigger questions and to relationships that we might have with others and cultural beliefs, norms, and situations. The more excellent autoethnographies also demonstrate verisimilitude. So that is what I'm hoping to do with this piece of research itself. So the research questions I had when I embarked on this was, one, how did my late Uncle James Harvey Pegram influence my understanding of baseball culture? And more importantly, how has my research into his life and career influenced my appreciation of that culture? So to do this, I use recollection and reflective practice related to childhood memories, cultural artifacts, searches through newspaper archives, photos, news reports, and family history. And as a result, what we have here is essentially the story of a glove and a ball and the miles, memories, and years in between. So a little bit of background on my family. My father was the youngest of 7 children. That is him there in the foreground on the right in the light gray suit. And behind him in the darker gray suit on the far right is my Uncle Jim. And my dad's older brothers are also standing behind him. Bob, who was wearing the glasses, to my father's right, and then to his right, Ray, in the black suit, also played quite a bit of baseball, and their names will come up here and there during this presentation. Now, my family grew up in the town of Princeton, Indiana, which is the county seat of Gibson County. You'll see it down there in the red shaded area. It's also known as the tri-state area, where Indiana, Kentucky, and Illinois sort of come together. Now, my cousin Mike once said that Princeton is about 8 beers from Louisville, and that will tell you, its approximate location to maybe the nearest metropolitan area if you're not counting Evansville. Now, my introduction to baseball did not come in Princeton, Indiana. It actually came at Dodger Stadium on June 6, 1971. That was my first baseball game. The Dodgers were playing the Mets that afternoon, but more so than that, it was Old Timers Day. And it was, I believe, the very first Old Timers Day ever held at Dodger Stadium, commemorating the 10th anniversary of the ballpark's existence. You'll see here a team picture of many Dodger legends. You'll see, you might notice Roy Campanella there on the far left of the photo. Sandy Koufax is in there as well. And in the middle, in the suit, is Casey Stengel. And Casey Stengel, as you see here in this picture, before that ceremony, he's about ready to hand my father a pen, I believe. My dad took this picture. Casey Stengel signed my glove. And you will see his signature there at the top. It's sort of faded. But right below that, you will also see the signature of Gil Hodges, who was managing the New York Mets that day. And I also believe the last time he ever donned a Dodgers jersey was at that Old Timers event prior to the game. So that gave me a little bit of an early introduction into the relationship between Gil Hodges and my Uncle Jim. I had gotten to meet Gil, although my memory of that is very vague, but we did attend the game and have really fantastic seats. But it was a little less than a year later that Hodges died suddenly, April of 1972. And from that point forward, I came to understand a little bit better the relationship that Gil had with my uncle. This picture here of Gil Hodges, this black and white shot, was one, or it was very similar to one that was framed in my uncle's den or his study when I would go to visit him. You would see this picture hanging up pretty prominently. And any information that you might have about Gil Hodges would show clearly that he was born in Princeton, Indiana. He did grow up in nearby Petersburg, but the connection is definitely there. Now, in Gil Hodges' biography that was written by Clavin and Perry, they mention Jim a couple of places in that book, but they predominantly talk about Jim being part of a group of youngsters, including Gil Hodges and his brother, that were part of a tryout camp for the St. Louis Browns. As the book notes, Jim was offered a contract. Gil was not offered a contract at that time. Now, the Jim Pegram I knew was more of a businessman. It wasn't until later that I kind of understood that he was also very much ingrained in baseball, but I knew him as a very shrewd entrepreneur and businessman because he owned several McDonald's restaurants in the Sacramento area when I was growing up. This is a picture of him there on the left in one of his newly built restaurants. This is circa 1975, I believe. That is my mother in the fur coat in the foreground and my aunt behind her. And looking back, it was some of Jim's connections and his business, dealings and relationships that helped give me an opportunity that many kids my age didn't have. I was lucky enough to attend about 6 World Series games in 77 and 78 between the Dodgers and the Yankees. And I also attended the 1978 All-Star Game. Now, in 1977, prior to, I believe it was Game 5 of that series, my dad and I headed to downtown Los Angeles to meet with my uncle before the game. And we met him at the Biltmore Hotel. This is the lobby that you see here. Pretty much looked the same back in 1977. But we met up with my uncle, and then another gentleman settled up next to my uncle, and they started to talk. And I recognized him, but I couldn't place it at first until my dad then leaned over and whispered, "That is Ray Kroc." So my uncle, with his business with McDonald's, had gotten to know Ray Kroc pretty well. And they talked openly, not really about business so much, but about baseball. And one of the things that Ray Kroc admitted, or really kind of talked about at length, was the need to trade one of his outfielders, George Hendrick. And this was, like, to me, inside information that I was really kind of, privy to. I remember on Monday when I returned to school telling everybody in my class, "Hey, I've got this inside information. The Padres are going to trade George Hendrick, and you can bank on it." The trade did happen, but not for about another 6 months. I believe Hendrick was traded to the Cardinals around May, maybe early June of the following season. Now, my uncle was also, so adept at understanding the game of baseball and seeing all of the various things that can go wrong. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He could really laugh a lot about some of the things that went on in the sport, but he really enjoyed it when he saw something about to happen or was coming and predicted it. And that's what happened in 81. I believe the last game that I attended with my uncle was Game 5 of the 1981 series at Dodger Stadium. And that was a game, it was played in the late afternoon. And Reggie Jackson, you could see in right field just the way that the sun was hitting him and the shadows were being cast behind him. My uncle duly predicted that Reggie was going to have some difficulty in that outfield and really thought he shouldn't be out there. Lo and behold, I think it was somewhere around the 5th or 6th inning, Davey Lopes floated a routine pop-up in Jackson's direction, and he ended up missing it. Hit him right in the chest, led to a Dodger rally, and the Dodgers ended up winning that game. Now, my uncle passed away prematurely in 1987 at the age of 64. And you see his gravesite here in Princeton, Indiana. My aunt has since passed away when this photo was taken. She passed about 10 years ago or so. And you'll also see here the names of Jim's children. He had 4 boys, Jimmy, Mike, DeMont, and Gil. And yes, Gil was named after Gil Hodges. And the 4 of them will come up a little bit later in this presentation. Now we're going to fast forward from 1987 all the way to 2020. And this is where this becomes a little bit of a COVID-19 story. I'm sure that we all want to forget COVID-19, but it is very much embedded in what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the research that I conducted on my uncle's career. In April, I received word that Jim's second son, Mike, had been inducted into the Indiana State or the Indiana Sports Hall of Fame. And in looking at that and doing some further research, I saw that Jim had already been inducted into the Greater Evansville Baseball Hall of Fame. And as a result, from that point forward, all through the summer and into the fall, I spent a lot of time digging into old newspaper reports and really trying to get a sense of the history here, particularly Jim's. So that starts in looking at his professional career as laid out by baseballreference.com. This is what his page looks like. Career minor leaguer, but he was indeed a professional baseball player. And you'll see here that the 3 seasons that they have statistical information for him is 1942, 1946, and 1948. I really wanted to see if I could close some of the gaps there where we didn't have any numbers. And I can say that to some degree, I was able to do that with the 1949 Evansville Braves. And I'll get to that point in a moment. But before he became a professional, Jim did play high school baseball. This is a picture of him in the 1939, or with the 39 Princeton High School baseball team. You'll see him back there where the arrow is pointed. And it was a couple of years later after he graduated that, as it was stated in Hodges' biography, that yes, indeed, Jim was part of a tryout camp with the St. Louis Browns. This is right out of high school. They did play a local amateur team out of Princeton. And you'll see here in this box score for the St. Louis camp team, Pegram, the catcher, had a hit in 2 at-bats and scored a couple of runs. What you'll also notice here are a couple of last names, Hodge at third base and Hodge at pitcher. Gil Hodge, and he was known as Hodge in this particular context. I'm going to talk somewhat about the Hodges discrepancy. But here you'll see the box score Hodge. And Jim and Gil were very much part of that tryout camp. But Jim was one of the ones who was signed to a contract. Gil Hodges was not. Gil went on to play a little bit of college ball before then moving on to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, Jim was signed to a team out of Mayfield, Kentucky, but that team ended up going belly up, and Jim actually wasn't able to report the following spring. Now, that the rest of that summer, Jim ended up playing American Legion ball in Princeton, and so did Gil Hodges, or in this case, again, Gil Hodge. You'll see here a box score, Jim Pegram at catcher. Now, you'll also see a B. Pegram for Bob. He was also part of that team. And you'll see there, the Hodge at shortstop. That team went on to the regionals. They ended up losing to a team from East Chicago. Jim barely got into that game, ended up, I believe, playing in the later innings, and had 1 at bat and 4 putouts. Now, the following year, Jim did sign a contract with St. Louis and ended up heading to Huntington, West Virginia, late in the season. And you'll see here, this is the Princeton, Indiana, one of the daily newspapers, and it's right in the middle of World War II. You'll see the headline here regarding the Germans crashing through Russian lines. But boy, right in the middle of all of that, the big news along with it is Pegram goes to a baseball league in West Virginia. And Jim actually had some success there in the late part of the season. He helped lead the team to the state league title at the end of the season as far as the standings go. They did have a playoff system, and the Huntington Jewels ended up losing in the playoffs. But in the first round, you'll see here they ended up taking on a team from Welch. They lost game 1, but Jim was the starting catcher in that game, and he was catching a pitcher by the name of Cliff Fannin. And Cliff Fannin went on to have a reasonably good career with the St. Louis Browns. So Jim's, opening season, played the last couple of months, were, I think, relatively successful. But the following year, he was called into service. He ended up in the Navy, and it was eventually a machinist mate, first class. Think about Steve McQueen in the Sand Pebbles. That's about what my uncle is doing, and there are often times when I'm seeing that movie, I'm like, that was pretty much what Uncle Jim was doing. And he ended up in the South Pacific. About the time that the war ended, Jim suffered a pretty, serious broken arm on board the ship. He ended up in the hospital. He was in the hospital for quite a while because I believe he also caught malaria while he was there. And so it was a couple of months before he eventually ended up coming home. He ended up coming home, I think it was, about mid-October of 1945. So in 1946, he decides he's going to make a comeback. He has been discharged from the service, and he ends up in San Antonio, Texas, trying to get on there with the Toledo Mud Hens. Both of them ended up leaving for pro ball sometime later that spring, but it didn't quite work out for Jim. He ended up back in Princeton and played again on the American Legion team. In 1946, as they're getting their season, underway, they played a game against an amateur team from Mount Carmel, Illinois, and the pitcher that day for that Mount Carmel team, known as the Meissner Radios, was Don Little. And my uncle ended up hitting a towering triple off Little, very similar to the one that Vic Wirtz hit off of him that Willie Mays tracked down in center field and caught. But Willie Mays wasn't on the field that day, and Jim ended up with the triple. But both Jim and Don Little ended up on that American Legion team in 1946 and were both signed to contracts to play for the Auburn Cayugas in that 46 season. My uncle stayed on for the 1947 season as well. I have not been able to find or track down any statistics regarding his time in Auburn in that season, but he definitely did play in 46. This page from a 1947 program does show that Jim was on the roster. He was playing, and I have yet to be able to dig out information about his at-bats in that 47 season. Now, in 1948, about midway through the summer, Jim signed a contract with the Waterloo Whitehawks. That was a team within the Chicago White Sox organization. And in his first couple of weeks or so with the club, had some, moderate success there. Was known as a pinch hitter, had a couple of game-winning hits, and was being recognized enough that they ended up doing a profile on him in the local newspaper, as you see here. Now, later in the season, however, that old injured arm kind of came up and became somewhat of a problem. There were news reports that he was having trouble throwing the ball back to the pitcher. And if you're a catcher and you're having some arm trouble, well, we know that that can be a very difficult situation. And so Jim tried to fight through that, but eventually later that summer, the Whitehawks released him. Now, in 1949, he signed on late in the season with Evansville Braves. He was going to be mostly used as a pinch hitter. Unfortunately, back then there was no universal DH, so that might have really helped Jim's baseball career if that had been the case, but unfortunately it was not. But, Baseball Reference didn't have him listed as having at-bats or that record is incomplete. But I was able to find some, as you see here in this particular box score. Yes, he did have at-bats with that Evansville club. But that pretty much ended his professional career. But the story's not over. In 1950, Jim enlisted in the Army. This was during the Korean War conflict, and ended up playing on a team out of Fort Knox, Kentucky. That is him seated on the front row, second from the right. The man on the far right, who is to Jim's left, is Corky Valentine, who would go on and pitch for the Cincinnati Reds. Jim and Corky had become pretty good friends during that time, and in fact, Jim would later attend some of Corky's games and has had some humorous stories to tell about Corky. But one of the things that I would like to do is find out more about this Fort Knox team and how they were built and the games that they played, because based on some of the limited reports I have seen, it was a substantial ball club that was playing out of Fort Knox. He played out of Fort Knox for a few seasons, but the story is still not over. In 1960, and that is Jim in the back row on the far right, he was a manager for the Princeton American Legion team that ended up winning the state championship. Now, baseball, like I said, is in my family's blood. It's particularly in Jim's immediate family's blood. His 4 sons all partake in baseball at various levels. Jimmy, the oldest you see there on the left, that is him in Florida as he was getting ready to play at Edison Junior College. He had also played at Indiana University. Mike, there in the middle, played quite a bit of baseball in Princeton, as did the 2 younger boys, DeMont and Gil. And overall, Southern Indiana has ended up producing a number of tremendous ball players. Aside from Gil Hodges, Don Mattingly was out of Evansville. You've got Scott Rowland, who is being inducted this year in the Hall of Fame. Andy Bennis and Clint Barmas, also major leaguers from the area. And though he didn't actually play Major League Baseball, Dave Niehaus, also from Southern Indiana, from Princeton. Dave Niehaus attended high school with my dad. That is a whole other research project and a whole other discussion. But the region does have definitely or has had some influence on the sport for sure. Now, in 1970, Gil Hodges Field was officially dedicated in Princeton, and the day after, Mike ended up being the winning pitcher in an American Legion ball game, and he actually also went 3 for 3. So, that's a Shohei Ohtani type player back in 1970. Now, after Gil passed away in 1972, news reports were actually quoting Jim and discussing him, of course, as a friend. And Jim offered his own thoughts on Gil. The picture that ended up in the newspapers was the one that I often saw in Jim's den or office when I was growing up. And those same reports were also stating that Hodges' last name was not Hodges. It actually was Hodge. And the reports, interestingly, said that Hodges himself had explained this to a Princeton newspaper writer that, it became Hodges after there was a mess up on my name and my first contract. And he didn't want to upset the apple cart, so he just left it at Hodges. So I don't know to what extent that story is real, the extent to which it's made up, because, nobody's ever made up anything in a small town newspaper before. But that news report did make it in other places, such as the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, that did print the story that his last name really was Hodge. Now, Clavin and Perry have noted this discrepancy in their biography on Hodges. And even though, there actually are team photos. You see this basketball team photo where you see it's G. Hodge, number 11 there, middle row on the right. His brother Bob is also, Hodge. It's a little bit smudged out in this picture, but both of them were known as Hodge. And some of the people that were quoted in that book were saying, I thought his last name was Hodge. Many kids thought the last name was Hodge, but Clavin and Perry try to kind of dispel that myth a little bit by digging up some other information, particularly this gravesite here that, it's Gil's grandparents in Patoka, Indiana, that in fact the last name was Hodges, not Hodge. And Mark Gent so kindly sent me a picture that was given to him by the Hodges family of Gil Hodges' high school diploma in Petersburg, showing that, in fact, the name was Gilbert Ray Hodges. So, how this discrepancy happened between Hodge and Hodges, and I stumbled upon this by accident during my research, I think is part of the mythology that happens with someone. And in Princeton, perhaps, they had gotten to know him as Hodge, and so therefore he was always going to be Hodge, Really a very interesting story there within the community of Princeton. So now let's fast forward to December of 2021. Gil, of course, finally voted into the Hall of Fame. And so about that time, I decided to do a little bit more digging. And what I came across at that time was a 1948 Waterloo Whitehawks baseball that was signed by the team, including Charles Comiskey II. So I started looking at the ball, and I remembered, of course, that Jim had played for a short time with that 48 team, and they had all kinds of pictures of the signatures. There's Charles Comiskey. And so I started looking and looking and looking and looking, and I just kind of figured, well, shoot, this was either signed before Jim's time there or after. But then came the very last picture, and there is a signature in the middle. And I would know that signature anywhere. My dad signs the last name Pegram very, very similarly. I contacted Jim's son, said, hey, look, I've found this baseball. Your dad signed this back in 1948, and we purchased it, and it is now with the family in Minden, Nevada. So back to my research questions. How did my late uncle influence my understanding of baseball culture? How did my research into his life and career influence my appreciation of that culture? And so that leads to the so what here, right? A deeper look into the archival research, better serve my sense of a collective memory and pride, and my own baseball heritage and culture, because of a number of reasons. The research has been invaluable, and I found myself more connected to my uncle's story and more connected to the story of Princeton and Hodge, or Hodges, however you want to think of that, more than ever. I learned that box scores can tell a story. I always knew this, but I never really dug into them and asked them to tell stories and looked for the stories that they tell the way that I had during those 2 years. The news reports can tell a story, and over time, these stories can take on, as with the Hodges discrepancy, kind of mythic proportions. I learned things about my family, including about my family that even Jim's sons did not know. That would be primarily that Jim did play in Texas and was trying out for the Toledo Mud Hens. That was a discovery that nobody had been quite aware of. I think that I definitely learned that Jim had a potential major league career here, and it was derailed by a war injury. And those are circumstances that gave me a lot greater appreciation for his outlook on life. Never in the short time that I had got to spend with Jim did I ever sense regret. He went on and became, as I mentioned, a successful businessman, a good father to 4 successful sons. But there is a saying within the family that it is what it is, and whatever life ends up providing you, those are the circumstances, and you move on from there. And definitely that part, I guess if you want to call it culture, is definitely something that I came to understand better. And if nothing else, I learned that baseball offers a tangled web of coincidences and relationships, right, with some of the players that Jim got to play with. And one of those players, and I'm going to end here because you can't make this stuff up, one of the players that Jim played with in Waterloo was an outfielder by the name of Jim Busby. Now, Jim went on to have some success with the Chicago White Sox and then with the Baltimore Orioles. And while he was with the Orioles late in his career, he was teammates with a young pitcher named Artie Portocarrero. Now, why is that important? Well, back in 1998, when I first moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and I was teaching at a small art school downtown, one of my students, and I believe she took this picture, one of my students was a young lady named Ashley Portocarrero. That was Arnie's granddaughter. And That spring of 1998, Mike, as you see here in the gray sport jacket, was the owner of a Kentucky Derby winning horse, Real Quiet. And on the Monday following that Kentucky Derby win, Ashley was among a number of students who expressed joy and, excitement over the fact that my cousin had won the Kentucky Derby. This was, again, none other than Arnie Portocarrero's granddaughter. And Ashley had a younger brother. His name was Dominic Portocarrero. He played high school baseball in the Phoenix area and then went on to play college baseball at none other than Paradise Valley Community College, where I have been residential faculty for the past 10 years. Like I said, you just can't make this up. Thank you very much for your time.